Standing Tall. Chapter 1. Carrie got up early on the day of the spelling test and asked her dad to help her go through the list of words.
"You're good at spelling,"
said Dad.
"Don't worry."
Carrie asked her mum to test her on the way to school. She spelled nearly all the words right, but as they walked up to the school gates, her mum said, "Last one, scare." S-C, said Carrie. A-I? It's an R, not an I, Mum said. You got it right with Dad. Carrie looked down at the ground. She found learning spellings easy, but this was only the second week at her new school, and she still felt nervous. At her old school, she'd had lots of friends, but she didn't have many at her new school yet. She didn't want to go through the school gates. "Don't worry," Mum said. "You'll be all right." Carrie wasn't so sure. She was quite small for her age, and she had a quiet voice, and no one seemed to notice her in class, except Mandy. Mandy was tall, with long, fair hair, and she was clever. She always seemed to get everything right. Everyone wanted to be her friend. Their teacher was called Miss Wallace. She came in smiling brightly and spent the first few minutes talking about her new pet kitten called Lola. "Lola gets very hungry, but I'm too busy to go shopping every day. I'm going to buy tins of meow in packs of 3 from now on. Here's a sum to work out," said Miss Wallace. "If I buy 2 packs of 3 tins, how many tins will I have?" A few children put up their hands, but Miss Wallace looked at Carrie. Carrie was good at sums. She tried to work this one out, but everyone was looking at her. That made it harder to think. She knew there were 2s and 3s in the problem. 5, she whispered. Carrie heard a few children laughing. "Please be quiet," said Miss Wallace. "Do you know the answer, Mandy?" Mandy grinned at Carrie. 6, of course. It's easy peasy." "Good," said Miss Wallace. After playtime, it was time for the spelling test. Miss Wallace had written 4 sets of letters on the board: air, R, ear, and ear. "I'll say a sentence, then I'll choose one of you to come and write the word on the board," said Miss Wallace. "Let's start with this one. I went to the fair." A girl called Sandra got it right. "I saw a big brown bear," said Miss Wallace. Ahmed got that right. "I want to go over there." Miss Wallace always left the hard ones until last. Mandy spelled there. Miss Wallace said, "Very good, Mandy. Now, Carrie, you've not put your hand up. Try this one. You can't scare me." Carrie walked slowly up to the board. "So, Carrie, how do you spell scare?" asked Miss Wallace. Some of the children giggled. Miss Wallace looked crossly at them. Carrie began to write on the board, S-C-A. Then she stopped. She couldn't remember what came next. Miss Wallace smiled at Carrie and asked, "What's the next letter?" "I," said Carrie quietly. "No, try again," said Miss Wallace. "She got it wrong," Mandy shouted. "She put an I in, miss." "Mandy," called Miss Wallace, "please don't shout out. Carrie, would you like to have another go?" Carrie wrote scare on the board. She got it right this time. "Well done, Carrie. Good girl," said Miss Wallace. Carrie turned and smiled at the rest of the class, but it was nearly playtime and no one really noticed. After lunch, Carrie went out into the playground. The girls were playing chase. "Do you want to play?" Sandra called. "No way!" shouted Mandy. "She's such a wimp. She'd be no good on our team. We might scare her." "Don't be mean, Mandy. We all make mistakes," Sandra said. "Not all the time," said Mandy. "Hey, Carrie, how do you spell scare?" Everyone stared so hard at Carrie that she had to turn away, and she didn't open her mouth again for the rest of the afternoon. Chapter 2. When Carrie got home, she felt so unhappy she just sat in front of the television. She could do sums and spellings just like everyone else. She might even be good at chase if they would just give her a chance. Carrie could feel something down the side of the chair. She pulled it out. It was one of Mum's magazines. On the cover was a picture of a tall woman. Carrie looked closely at the cover. "Keep fit, standing tall. Do people make fun of you? You need to stand tall. Exercises to stretch you. Read how." Carrie opened the magazine and read the heading. "Stand tall, feel good, look good. You've all heard of exercising. Now try stretchy-sizing." There was a full-page picture of the woman from the cover standing in front of a mirror with her eyes closed. She was smiling. Carrie started to read the next page. It said, "Take a very deep breath. Pretend an elastic band is fixed to the top of your head. It is pulling your head gently upwards." This sounded like being tortured, but Carrie read some more. "You feel your back start to stretch. Your neck starts to feel much longer, and your head feels as light as a balloon. It starts floating. It rises up into the air until it bumps into the ceiling." Carrie read this again. Then she looked at the picture again and looked at the title again too. "Stand tall, feel good, look good. Stretchy-sizing is easy." Perhaps it was worth a try. If it worked, it might solve all her problems. So Carrie took the magazine upstairs and went into her parents' bedroom. There was a mirror hanging on the wall. When Carrie looked in the mirror, she could just see the top of her head. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and imagined the elastic band pulling the top of her head. She imagined herself getting taller and taller. She imagined her head feeling so light it started to float slowly up towards the bedroom ceiling. Time passed, but her head hadn't touched the ceiling. At last, Carrie opened her eyes and looked in the mirror again. Now she could see her eyebrows and her eyes and her nose, so surely she was a bit taller. Stretchy-sizing was easy. If she did it 3 times a day, she might end up taller than Mandy. Carrie was so excited, she rushed downstairs to tell Dad, but he was on the phone. When he put the phone down, he said,
What's made you look so cheerful?
"It's a secret," said Carrie. She decided not to tell Dad about stretchy-sizing, not yet. She wanted him to notice that she was taller.
By the way, how did the spelling test go?
Asked Dad. That's a secret too, said Carrie, laughing. Now she was standing taller, she knew she'd feel good and look good. When she woke up in the morning, she looked in the mirror again. She could still see her eyes and her nose, but only by standing on tiptoe. She needed more stretchy sizing. "Breakfast!" Mum called from downstairs. Carrie closed her eyes. She took a deep breath and tried very hard to imagine her back getting straighter and longer. She imagined herself getting taller and taller, and then she imagined her head floating up like a balloon towards the bedroom ceiling. She waited. She tried extra hard, and then she opened her eyes to see her mum, staring at her with a puzzled look on her face. "What are you up to?" asked Mum. Carrie didn't know what to say. "Do you think I look taller?" asked Carrie. Mum smiled. "Well, maybe just a little bit," she said, "but you don't need to worry about that. It's not what you look like that matters. It's what you're like inside." Chapter 3. Carrie walked into the classroom, still hoping she looked a bit taller, but nobody seemed to notice because there was a new boy sitting by himself looking nervous. Carrie thought he looked almost too small to be in their class. "This is Sam," said Miss Wallace. "I hope you'll all make him feel welcome and help him to make new friends." Then she asked everyone in the class to tell Sam their name and something about themselves. When it was her turn, Miss Wallace told Sam how naughty her kitten had been. Everyone laughed. As a special treat to welcome Sam to the class, Miss Wallace asked him to choose a story from one of the big books in the book corner. Sam chose a story about some owls. Miss Wallace read the story with the class. Afterwards, she asked some questions, and everyone put up their hands, except Sam. Mandy whispered, "He's so small, you can hardly see him." Some of the class started to giggle, and Carrie giggled as well, until she remembered how she'd felt only the day before. She knew what it was like when everyone was laughing at you, and she felt sorry for Sam. "5 minutes to playtime," Miss Wallace said. "Let's see if we can remember our spellings from yesterday, shall we? How about scare?" That was easy. They all put up their hands. Carrie shouted, "Can I write it, miss?" "Please don't shout out, Carrie," said Miss Wallace. "I wonder if Sam can write it." Everyone stared at Sam. His cheeks went as red as tomatoes. Carrie could hear him saying to himself, S-C-A-R-E, but he didn't sound very sure about it.
"I'm no good at spelling,"
he whispered to Carrie. "But you know how to spell it," said Carrie. "Go and write it on the board." Sam walked slowly to the front of the class. He looked small and scared. He started to write, saying each letter as he wrote it.
S-C-A-I.
"Ha ha!" cried Mandy. "He's put an I in, miss, just like Carrie did yesterday." The whole class burst into giggles. "Mandy, I won't have you calling out in class like that," called Miss Wallace. She turned to Sam and smiled. "That was nearly right, Sam. It was very brave of you to give it a try, as you are new to the class. Well done." Mandy looked cross because she had been told off. As everyone got ready for playtime, Miss Wallace said to Carrie, "You know what it's like to be new in the class. Will you look after Sam at playtime?" Carrie looked for Sam in the playground, but all she could see was a crowd of children playing, shouting, and laughing. Carrie wished she was tall enough to see what was going on. She thought about stretchy sizing. She even closed her eyes. But then she heard Mandy shouting, "You can't play with us, Sam. You can't get anything right." Carrie suddenly felt very angry. She stood up straight and called out, "You don't know everything, Mandy. I bet you can't spell stretchy sizing." Everyone went quiet. Then Mandy said, "That's not fair. That's not a real word." "It's not fair to tease people either," Carrie said, loud and clear. "And why should you always choose who plays chase? I'll play with you, Sam."
So will I,
said Ahmed.
So will I,
said Frankie. "Me too," said Sandra. Carrie looked at Sam. He was smiling at her, but Carrie thought how small and scared he still looked. As the others ran off to start the game, she walked over to him. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked him kindly. "Some of the boys run really fast when we're playing chase,"
I can run fast too,
said Sam quietly. Then he raced off. Carrie watched him. She had never seen anyone run so fast. He was the best player of chase she had ever seen. Everyone was amazed as he darted and dashed round the playground. Carrie could see that Sam felt good, and he looked good too. Sam didn't need stretchy sizing, and nor did Carrie. They were both standing tall now.
Storm at Sea. Chapter 1. Matt and Katie were on holiday. Every year, their parents rented the same holiday cottage. It was on the cliffs, high above a little Cornish bay. Matt and Katie loved going to the seaside. This year, Dad had bought them a dinghy and had promised he would teach them both how to row. Matt had already had a few lessons, and he really enjoyed it. "You two can go ahead down to the beach," said Dad. "But don't get in the boat until we get there. I'll bring the oars, as they're a bit tricky to carry. Mum will bring the life jackets."
"I'll just finish getting the picnic ready,"
said Mum.
"and then we'll join you on the beach. Don't forget, you're not to go in the boat until Dad and I arrive."
Matt and Katie carried their dinghy down the long, winding path to the beach. The sea was calm, and it was quite sunny, but there were a few grey clouds in the sky.
"Is it going to rain?"
asked Katie. "I hope not," said Matt, noticing the clouds. He was looking forward to another rowing lesson with Dad. Katie hadn't been very interested in learning how to row yet, but Matt knew it was only a matter of time before she insisted on having lessons too. When they got down to the beach, Katie said,
"I'm sure it's okay if we just put the boat in the water."
"No," said Matt. "Mum and Dad said we have to wait for them."
"Please, Matt,"
begged Katie.
"we can just float about in the shallow water."
"Dad and Mum told us to wait," repeated Matt. But Katie was already running down to the sea, dragging the dinghy behind her.
We'll be all right, Matt. We can just sit in the boat until Mum and Dad get here.
Matt sighed and looked out across the calm sea. In the distance, he could see Gull Rock glinting in the sunshine. Last year, Katie and he had gone with Mum and Dad on a boat ride to see Gull Rock. It had looked exciting from the speedboat, but then the captain told them about the strong currents that swept around Gull Rock. He said many boats had been wrecked there in the past. After that, Matt was quite glad to see Gull Rock from the safety of the shore. When Matt looked back at Katie, she was dragging the dinghy into the gentle waves that were breaking on the sand. He was going to call out to her to come back. Then he thought maybe there was no harm in just sitting in the dinghy in the shallow water. He looked around for a big stone. "Hang on, Katie!" he yelled.
What?
Called Katie. "Give me the rope. I'm going to put this heavy stone on it so the boat can't drift off."
Okay, hurry up then,
said Katie. Matt and Katie got into the dinghy, which was bobbing up and down in the shallow water. Matt enjoyed the sound of the water that was gently rocking the dinghy. Matt looked along the beach. There were no other people there. He tried to see if Mum and Dad were on their way down the path, but there was no sign of them. A seagull was flying back to its nest near the top of the cliff. Katie was busy trailing her hand in the water, catching clumps of seaweed, and Matt daydreamed. Neither of them noticed that the dinghy was drifting gently away from the shore. Then Katie suddenly shouted,
Look, Matt! The rope has come away from the stone.
Matt saw the end of the rope floating in the water. Then he looked down into the dark water. The sea was much too deep. He wouldn't be able to jump in and pull the dinghy back to shore. As he looked around, he heard a rumble of thunder, and just at that moment, the sun disappeared behind a big, dark cloud. Chapter 2.
What are we going to do now?
Kate's voice trembled. Matt could see she was frightened. I don't know, he said, trying hard not to show how scared he was. Dad must get down here soon. He was going to bring the oars. Then Matt remembered something that made him feel sick. Mum had the life jackets.
You should have fixed the rope better,
moaned Katie. And you should have waited for Mum and Dad. Like they said, shouted Matt. Katie had been clever, as usual, in getting her own way, but Matt knew he would get the blame for getting in the dinghy. He felt miserable and couldn't think what to do. The dinghy kept on drifting and the waves were getting bigger all the time. Help! Yelled Matt. Help! But there was no one around to hear his cries.
Help!
Screamed Katie at the top of her voice.
Someone help us, please!
The dinghy had drifted out from the calm water of the bay, and the waves were much bigger now. Dark clouds raced across the sky. The seagulls swooped low, making wild cries, as if warning Katie and Matt that they were drifting into terrible danger.
I'm frightened,
said Katie. Don't worry, said Matt. Mum and Dad are bound to come down to the beach soon. They'll know what to do. But Katie began to sob. The wind was coming in strong gusts, and the dinghy was being pushed out towards the open sea. The drizzling rain soon became a downpour. Katie's cries grew louder. "Stop crying, Katie. I think I can hear something," said Matt. The wind was so noisy that they had to listen hard. They could hear, in the distance, the chugging sound of a fishing boat engine. "Come on, Katie! Shout for help!" yelled Matt. The two children shouted as loudly as they could, but their voices were lost in the strong wind. Matt began to wave wildly, but the dinghy rocked dangerously from side to side. Katie screamed,
"Matt, sit down! You're going to tip the boat over."
Matt sat down again. "It's no good, Katie. The fishing boat hasn't seen us," he said grimly. The two children watched, feeling miserable, as the fishing boat disappeared into the misty darkness.
"What's going to happen to us?"
cried Katie. Matt didn't know. All he could think of was how worried Mum and Dad would be when they reached the beach and found that Katie and he had disappeared. Then Katie cried out.
"Oh no! Look, Matt!"
She stared ahead, horrified. Matt looked over his shoulder and saw that their dinghy was heading straight for Gull Rock. As Matt and Katie watched, a flash of lightning lit up the steep sides of Gull Rock, and there was a loud clap of thunder overhead.
"We're going to drown!"
cried Katie, and she crouched down in the dinghy. "Don't worry, Katie. Someone will help us," said Matt. But he knew she wouldn't believe him. Why should she? The fishing boat hadn't seen them. As the dinghy drifted nearer Gull Rock, Matt and Katie could hear a horrible booming sound as the waves crashed onto the great rock. Gull Rock had seemed exciting when they saw it on a calm day last year, but in the storm it looked terrifying, rising out of the rain and spray like a gigantic, towering castle.
"We're going to crash into Gull Rock!"
screamed Katie. Matt wasn't listening. He was looking around to see if there was any place they could land on Gull Rock. Then he spotted a ledge sticking out above the waves. Matt knew that if they could get onto that ledge, they might be safer. "Come on, Katie, you've got to help me," said Matt. "We'll have to paddle the boat with our hands."
"I can't,"
said Katie.
"I want Mummy."
"Look, Katie," said Matt, "it's our only chance. We have to get to that ledge there," he said, pointing. "We might be able to jump onto it." Chapter 3. Desperately, Katie and Matt paddled the dinghy towards the ledge. "Get ready to jump," said Matt, and he grabbed Katie's hand. 1, 2, 3, jump! Yelled Matt. Amazingly, they both landed on the ledge. Katie grabbed hold of the rock and hung on, but Matt slipped on the wet surface and slid back into the sea. Katie shrunk back against the rock. Then she saw Matt's head bobbing up and down in the surf. She watched him swim towards the ledge and grab a huge clump of seaweed. He pulled at it, trying to scramble onto the ledge, but his hands were too cold and stiff to hold on. A wave threw Matt against the rock. Katie was horrified to see blood streaming down her brother's face. He managed to grab the seaweed again, but he couldn't pull himself up onto the rock. Katie was scared, but she knew she had to help Matt. She leaned over the edge.
"Grab my hand!"
she shouted. With a great effort, Matt reached up and struggled to reach Katie's hand. At that moment, Matt's feet found a small ridge of rock that was buried by the swirling sea. He gripped it with his feet and flung himself forward. Katie grabbed the back of his t-shirt and pulled him onto the ledge. He lay there, gasping and panting. After a few minutes, Matt sat up and looked out to sea. The wind was blowing hard and the waves were huge. He glanced at Katie, who looked terrified. "The storm's getting worse," he thought. "The waves are going to drag us back into the sea." Suddenly, they heard a loud noise in the sky. Matt and Katie both looked up. At first, they couldn't see through the rain and clouds. Then, they saw a big helicopter hovering right above them. Matt and Katie waved and shouted, screaming at the top of their voices. "The helicopter has come to rescue us!" cried Matt. They watched as a man was lowered slowly down towards them. The man landed on the rock and put an arm around Katie. "It's okay. You're safe now," he said. He put Katie into a harness. "Don't worry, son. I'll be back for you in a minute," he shouted to Matt. Matt could hardly believe they were being rescued. He waved to the man. Just then, a huge wave swept over the ledge and washed Matt into the sea. Matt was so weak that he could hardly swim, and the water dragged him away from the ledge. Matt gazed up hopefully into the sky. He saw the man on the helicopter cable hovering above him. "Don't worry, son. I'll have you out of the sea in no time," he called to Matt. The next moment, Matt felt the man's strong arms putting him into the safety of the harness. "Having a quick swim, were you?" joked the man. Soon they were being lifted into the safety of the helicopter. Matt looked down and thought he saw the remains of the dinghy, torn to pieces on the jagged rocks. That could have been Katie and me, he thought. Once Matt was safely aboard the helicopter, he was wrapped in a blanket, just like Katie's. The man said to Matt, "Your mum and dad will be thrilled to see you safe and sound." It was a really stupid thing getting into the dinghy without them, but I expect you've learned your lesson. Matt looked at Katie. She nodded at him. "We certainly have," he said.
The Wrong Words. Chapter 1. Daryl woke up very early on his birthday. He couldn't wait to see what Uncle Max had sent him. Uncle Max always gave him amazing presents. One year, he had given him a special pair of glasses so he could see in the dark. Last year, Uncle Max had given him roller skates with motors in each wheel. Daryl hurried downstairs. In the hall, he found a big brown box with an envelope on it addressed to him. He read the birthday card inside.
"Happy birthday, Daryl. Please look after Mary the robot. She can walk, but I haven't had time to teach her to talk. She likes jokes and rhymes, so have fun teaching her. I hope you have a very happy birthday. Love, Uncle Max. P.S. Can you say this tongue twister? 3 thieves threw trumpets through trees.
Darryl tore open the big box. He soon found the robot and removed her carefully from the box. He couldn't wait to tell her some of his jokes. Darryl played with Mary every day, but even after 3 weeks, she still couldn't speak. Darryl had read lots of rhymes to Mary and told her lots of jokes.
What's the difference between a robber and a church bell?
He asked her one morning. Mary didn't answer.
It's easy,
said Darryl, answering his own joke.
One steals from the people and the other peels from the steeple.
But Mary didn't even smile. Darryl's mum said it had taken Darryl years to learn to talk. Now she wished she'd never taught him because he never shut up. Once, after Darryl had told Mary a very funny joke, he thought he'd heard a giggle. Maybe it had just been his old bed creaking. Then, one morning, when Darryl woke up, Mary was sitting on his bed. She was speaking in a slow robot voice, and he was surprised. She said, "Knock, knock." Darryl sat up, smiling.
Who's there?
He asked Mary. Darryl, she replied.
Darryl who?
He asked. Darryl be your robot talking, said Mary.
Oh, yes,
said Darryl, punching the air like footballers on the television.
Darryl B. That will be your robot talking. You can talk.
Darryl tried a joke on Mary.
Knock, knock,
he said. Mary replied, Who's there?
Irish stew,
said Darryl. Irish stew? Who? asked Mary.
Irish stew, in the name of the law,
said Darryl. Mary's laughter was a funny sound. Clunk, click, clunk, went Mary's dials. Why did the robber get caught stealing a big clock? She asked. Darryl knew the answer to that one.
He took too much time,
he answered. What do you call a boy who steals hamburgers? Asked Mary. Darryl didn't know. A hamburglar, replied Mary, and both she and Darryl burst out laughing. Darryl's mum came into his room.
Mary can talk, and she knows some brilliant jokes,
said Darryl.
Wait till you hear this.
Darryl asked Mary,
Do robots have brothers?
Quick as a flash, Mary replied, No, only transistors. Oh no, said Mum. Not 2 of you telling me corny jokes. I don't think I can stand it. Then Mary looked at Darryl and said, Carol?
My name's Darryl,
he said, laughing.
Carol is a girl's name.
Darryl, Carol, Barrel, said Mary. All the same.
What do you mean?
asked Darryl, puzzled. Then he realized why Mary didn't understand.
They sound the same, but they don't mean the same thing. You've got a lot to learn,
he told Mary. Darryl and Mary became best friends. Sometimes when Mary got excited or nervous, her words came out in the wrong order. Darryl would work out what she was trying to say. One day, Mary said, "I very am hungry. What is today tea for?"
I think you mean, I am very hungry. What is for tea today?
said Darryl.
What would you like?
Not poodles, said Mary.
Good,
said Darryl.
we don't eat dogs.
Then Darryl realized that Mary had meant to say pot noodles.
You are a robot funny.
Joked Darryl. You thank, said Mary shyly. Chapter 2. One day, Mary was alone in the house when there was a knock at the door. Mary called out, "Knock, knock," and she opened the door. There were 2 men.
Get out of our way, you stupid robot.
Growled one of them, pushing her aside. Mary had no idea what the men wanted. She couldn't understand why they were being nasty to her.
Quick, mate.
Said the other man.
Now's a good chance to rob the place.
What kind of robbery is the least dangerous? Stuttered Mary.
What is that daft robot saying now?
Asked one of the robbers.
It's just talking rubbish.
Said the other. A safe robbery, muttered Mary. Neither of the robbers were listening. They were busy stuffing jewelry and other things into a bag. What did the policeman say to his tummy? Said Mary quietly.
Can't we turn that thing off?
Said one of the robbers. You're under arrest, said Mary in her loudest voice. You're under arrest, she kept repeating. The robbers looked up. They didn't like the sound of that at all, and they didn't like the odd look on the robot's face.
Let's get out of here,
said one of the robbers.
That robot gives me the creeps,
said the other. So the 2 robbers dashed out of the front door, carrying a bag which had all Mum's jewellery in it, and more. They left the house in a mess and did not shut the front door. Mary sat down on the stairs, feeling very miserable. She hadn't known how to stop the robbers. Me, robot, useless, she said sadly. When Darryl came home from school, he was surprised to find the door open. He thought maybe Mary had gone for a walk, but he hoped not. Mary still didn't know her way round, so he was glad to find her sitting on the stairs.
Hey, Mary,
said Darryl.
I've just heard a brilliant new joke. Why are robots never afraid?
Darryl was surprised when Mary said nothing, so he gave her the answer.
Because they have nerves of steel.
Mary still said nothing. Darryl thought she looked strange. Then he noticed the lights on her control panel looked very dim.
What's up?
Asked Darryl.
Here's another joke. This will make you laugh. What do police fish ride in?
When Mary didn't reply, Darryl went on.
A squid car.
But Mary didn't even smile. Darryl went upstairs to get his joke book. He noticed that his mum's dressing table drawers were open. One drawer was empty. All the jewellery had gone. The room looked a mess.
Oh no! What's happened?
Thought Darryl. He ran downstairs to ask Mary what had happened and where the jewellery had gone.
Have you taken Mum's jewellery?
He asked her. Knock, knock, said Mary.
Not now,
said Darryl crossly.
This is serious. What's happened to Mum's room and her jewellery?
Before Mary could say anything, Mum arrived home. Darryl showed her the mess and the empty drawer. She was very upset.
I think Mary knows something about it,
said Darryl, and he went back downstairs to talk to Mary.
Have you taken Mum's jewellery?
Asked Darryl. Under a vest, said Mary.
Under a vest?
Asked Darryl.
What does that mean? Is that where you've hidden it?
But Mary wouldn't say anything more.
It's no good,
said Darryl when he went back upstairs to Mum.
I think Mary may have hidden your jewellery. She wouldn't have stolen it. But she's muddled for words, so I can't work out where it might be.
Well, we can't keep a robot who takes things, even if it is just to hide them. Mum sounded cross and she stormed out of the room. Chapter 3. Mary kept saying silly things. Knock, knock, said Mary.
Who's there?
Said Darryl. Two Mad Ben, said Mary.
Two Mad Ben who?
Said Darryl. Knock, knock, two Mad Ben, repeated Mary over and over again. Darryl went to tell his mum what Mary had been saying.
Her wiring must be wrong,
suggested Darryl.
Let's call Uncle Max.
When Uncle Max arrived, he was very puzzled. He spoke to Mary sternly.
Now, Mary, I want a straight answer. Where are all the things?
Knock, knock, said Mary. Two Mad Ben, roll the stings, under a vest, talk rubbish.
Well, you're right about the last bit,
said Uncle Max crossly.
You're certainly talking rubbish.
He was very annoyed.
I'm sorry,
he said to Mum and Darryl.
I'll have to take Mary away. I think she may have taken the jewellery somewhere, but I can't get any sense out of her.
Darryl watched Uncle Max packing Mary away in her box.
Knock, knock,
said Darryl, hoping to cheer her up with a joke, but Mary didn't reply. That night, Darryl went to bed feeling sad. He missed Mary's jokes, and he even missed the funny way she muddled her words. He couldn't believe that she might be a thief. She just couldn't be.
Let's hope Uncle Max can sort her out,
thought Darryl. He lay in bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars, but he couldn't sleep. He was tossing and turning. He kept thinking about the things Mary had said since the burglary. Darryl repeated the words to himself, hoping they were just another puzzle to solve.
Knock, knock. Was she telling him a joke?
He thought.
Why else might she say, knock, knock?
Suddenly, Darryl sat up in bed.
Of course,
he said aloud.
I bet she heard someone knocking at the door.
Darryl's thoughts were racing, trying to remember what Mary had said next.
Was it two Mad Ben? Perhaps she was trying to say two bad men.
Darryl felt like he was getting somewhere.
Two bad men knocking at the door. And what had Mary said next? Roll the stings? Maybe she meant to say, stole the rings.
Darryl jumped out of bed and ran downstairs to tell Mum.
Mum, Mum, I think I've worked out what Mary was trying to say.
He told Mum about the bad men. I think you might be right, Darryl, but what did she mean by under a vest?
Said
Darryl.
I haven't worked that bit out yet.
Quick, we'd better hurry, said Mum. We'll have to stop Uncle Max before he takes Mary apart. Darryl and his mum jumped into the car. Darryl was still in his pajamas. They had no time to lose. Uncle Max was surprised to see them both on his doorstep, and even more surprised to hear what they had to say.
You're just in time,
he said.
I was about to take Mary to bits.
Uncle Max called the police station. Minutes later, a policeman called at the door. Uncle Max invited him in. The policeman was very interested to hear about Mary's muddles.
Well,
he said,
this afternoon we arrested 2 men carrying a bag of stolen jewelry. When I said to them, "You're under arrest," one man turned to the other and said, "That daft robot must have told on us." Clever old Mary,
said Darryl.
Under a vest. Under arrest.
The next day, the policeman called at Darryl's home to return all of Mum's jewelry.
I'm really proud of you,
Darryl told Mary. So am I, said Mum, and I'm sorry I got cross with you. The lights on Mary's control panel twinkled brightly, and she said, "What do you call 2 thieves?" Mum and Darryl answered,
I don't know. What do you call 2 thieves?
A pair of knickers, said Mary, laughing. Darryl and Mum giggled, and even the policeman had to smile.
Deep water. Chapter 1. It was time to go home. There was the usual scraping sound of chairs being pushed back.
Remember to work on your class speeches for homework,
Miss Walker called, as everyone started talking and packing their school bags.
You can read them out first thing in the morning.
Jenny felt sick. Thinking about her speech made her tummy hurt. It felt as if she had a giant jellyfish squirming about inside her. She hated having to read aloud in class. She was sure everyone got really bored listening to her. Once, when Jenny was reading out her holiday diary, Lee West had even looked at his watch. Jenny noticed the flash of light as he held it up to get a better look. Lee had a posh watch. It was silver and blue, one that you could wear for deep-sea diving. Jenny had heard him laugh about it to someone once. Still, even if his watch was fantastic to look at, he must have been really bored listening to Jenny that time. Lee West was the sort of person who was never boring. He seemed so clever, and he always had loads of friends around him. He was always telling jokes and giving the thumbs up sign to people. He never did anything like that to Jenny. She sometimes wondered if he had ever even noticed her. Jenny watched Lee walk ahead of her as they left school. He had a certain sort of walk. He had a certain sort of laugh. Jenny never quite knew what it was, but she wished she had it too. She was sure Lee never had giant jellyfish squirming around in his tummy. He probably had wonderful dolphins, all leaping about with a sleek, shining confidence. Jenny sighed. Lee was just one of those people who was good at everything. She didn't think she was good at anything much, only swimming. Mum took her for lessons every morning, before most people were even up. Lee disappeared out of the school gate and into the alley. He was talking to an older girl from the next class up. They were laughing loudly, as if they had just heard the funniest joke in the world. Jenny trailed along behind. As she walked, she stared down at the scuffed toes of her supermarket trainers. Lee had those designer sports trainers, of course. They were the sort you saw on the telly adverts. Mum had said there wasn't any point buying things like that.
You grow too quickly,
she always grumbled. Mum seemed to think Jenny grew too quickly on purpose, just as an excuse to get new clothes. If Jenny hadn't been staring at her trainers, she might have missed it. But as she turned the corner into the alley, she nearly trod on it. Lee's watch, the posh deep-sea diving one, was lying right in the middle of the path. Jenny knew she should just pick it up and give it back to him, but she didn't want to have to run after him. Suppose she had to call out his name. Suppose she had to tap him on the back. Just the thought of it made the jellyfish in her tummy start squirming again. The best thing to do would be to take the watch home. She could get to school early after swimming and hand it into the office before Lee got there. Jenny bent down quickly and picked up the watch. Then she pushed it into the pocket of her school bag and ran home. Chapter 2.
I am going to talk about swimming. Swimming is something that...
Jenny's voice trailed away. Miss Walker had told them all to practice in front of the mirror. She said it would help, but it didn't seem to be working for Jenny. Her face looked as white as chalk, and her eyes were wide with panic. If she looked like this tomorrow, the class would think she'd been taken over by aliens. They'd probably all make a run for the door. She took a deep breath and started again.
I am going to talk about swimming. Swimming is something that...
Jenny scrunched up the notes she had been reading from and threw them down on the dressing table. Swimming wasn't anything special. Anyone could do it. All you had to do was float round and kick your legs about. What was so brilliant about that? Perhaps she could pretend to Miss Walker that she'd lost her voice. She stared at herself again, mouthing the words. She looked like a goldfish saying its prayers. Still, it was probably more interesting than her speech. Jenny flopped down onto the bed. Her school bag was there. She hugged it as if it was a teddy bear, and she cried. Long shadows crept into her room. Jenny heard the evening paper plop through the letterbox. A smell of onions was coming up from the kitchen. She sat up slowly. She had to be sensible. Mum would be calling her for dinner soon. Jenny didn't want Mum to know she'd been crying. She unzipped the pocket of her school bag, searching for the neatly folded hanky Mum always tucked in there. Instead, her fingers touched the cold, silver strap of Lee's watch. Jenny turned it over and over in her hand. The numbers round the edge of the face were the sort that glow in the dark. There was a button to press to show how deep you were diving. There was a tiny window that showed what the temperature was. Jenny let the watch lie against her wrist. She liked the silver against the pale white of her skin. Almost without thinking, Jenny put it on. She was surprised it fitted so well. It felt a bit heavy, but she didn't mind the heaviness. It made her feel important, powerful. She got up and walked over to the mirror again. She still looked pale and boring. Slowly, she pulled her shoulders back and stood up straighter. She tilted her chin slightly, the way Lee sometimes did. It made her face look different, stronger somehow. Her scrunched up speech was still there, lying near her hairbrush. Jenny opened it out again.
I'm going to talk about swimming. Swimming is something I started when I was 3 years old. Very soon, my swimming teacher said,
Jenny found that, after a moment, she wasn't even reading from the sheet. Thoughts and ideas seemed to flow through her.
I have been lucky. I've won lots of competitions, but when I'm in a race, I'm not really thinking about winning. I'm just loving the feeling of being in the water. It's as if I'm gliding through it, like a fish.
As the words flooded out of her, Jenny giggled with excitement. She suddenly seemed to have a certain sort of laugh. She swung round and walked across the room. She suddenly seemed to have a certain sort of walk. Turning back to the mirror, Jenny saw a flash of light from the watch in the glass. The flashes of silver seemed almost magical. So maybe that was it. Maybe Lee's watch really did have something magic about it. Maybe that was his secret.
Jenny, dinner time!
Mum called from downstairs. Jenny felt unhappy suddenly. What did she think she was doing? Even if Lee's watch did have a special power, it wasn't much use to her. She'd have to give it back tomorrow anyway.
Jenny! Coming!
Jenny slowly unfastened the watch. Already her face in the mirror seemed to be growing paler, growing more boring. By tomorrow morning, she'd be right back where she'd started. Unless... She pushed the thought away. She couldn't do it. It would be wrong. She might get into trouble. But then again, it wouldn't need to be for very long. Chapter 3. The sun spilled in through the classroom window. It was a warm day, but Jenny was wearing her thick winter jumper. She felt hot and uncomfortable, but she needed its long sleeves to cover her wrist. She hoped no one would notice how nervous she looked.
Now then,
Miss Walker smiled around at the class.
I'm sure you've all got some lovely speeches prepared for me. So, who's going to be very brave and go first?
Nobody moved.
Come on now, I can't wait to hear about all of your wonderful hobbies.
Jenny's hand didn't shoot up. The watch's powers weren't that magical. But as she raised her arms slowly into the air, she kept her back straight and her chin up.
I'll go first, Miss Walker.
Miss Walker looked surprised.
Are you quite sure?
She said.
I just want to get it over with.
Jenny kept her hand up as she spoke, waving it round slightly, like she'd seen Lee West do.
All right then. Would you...
Miss Walker never finished her sentence because there was a shout from behind. She's stolen my watch! Jenny's hand, still stuck in the air, seemed to freeze. Something terrible had happened. The sleeve of her jumper had slipped back. The magical blue and silver watch shone and glittered on her wrist like 1,000 jewels. She slumped back in her chair. She looked down at the table. She knew that everyone was staring at her. The jellyfish in her tummy woke up. "It went missing at school yesterday," Lee said angrily. "I realized it when I got home. My dad's furious."
Jenny,
Miss Walker's voice was as sharp as a knife. Jenny didn't answer. How could she possibly explain about the watch and the magic and the way it was going to help her? No one would understand. No one would believe her. Miss Walker sighed.
you'd better give Lee his watch and then go and see the headmaster. Perhaps he can get some sense out of you.
Mr. Atkins, the headmaster, frowned at Jenny. His eyes looked very fierce beneath his huge, hairy eyebrows. "You had better tell me why you're here."
No, I shouldn't have done it.
Jenny stuttered. "Done what?" asked Mr. Atkins. Jenny felt sick. She wondered what Mr. Atkins would do. He'd probably tell her mum. He'd probably tell Lee West's dad. He might even call the police. At the thought of the police, the jellyfish in her tummy did 3 giant somersaults. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Lee West peered round. "Not now, Lee," Mr. Atkins frowned again. "Can't you see I'm busy?" "But it's about Jenny, sir." "It's important," said Lee. One hairy eyebrow raised itself slowly. "What is it you want to say?" Lee didn't look at Mr. Atkins. Instead, he turned to Jenny. "I'm really sorry. I've only just remembered. You couldn't have stolen my watch. My cousin Meg was teasing me about it on the way home from school yesterday."
"I found it,"
Jenny blurted out.
"I was going to give it back this morning, but I wanted to wear it for a little while, just until the speeches were over."
Now it was Lee's turn to frown. "But why?"
"I wanted to wear it while I was giving my speech. I'm sorry. I know it sounds stupid."
Lee still looked puzzled. "It's a smartwatch. It looks good and everything, but it's not that great." Mr. Atkins said suddenly, "I don't know what's going on, but you seem to have sorted it out between yourselves. You'd better get back to class." Lee chatted as they walked together back down the corridor. Miss Walker made the others do some maths while she talked to me about the watch. It was only then that I remembered when I was last wearing it. But Jenny wasn't listening. She was just glad that she wasn't in trouble after all. "So that means you're lucky, doesn't it?" Lee went on. Jenny looked at him, suddenly realizing he had asked her a question.
"Why?"
she asked. "Well, we haven't started the speeches yet. Miss Walker was saving them until you got back. You'll still be able to go first, like you wanted." Chapter 4. The whole class was sitting on the carpet in a half circle in front of Miss Walker.
"Okay, Jenny,
said Miss Walker, giving her a bright smile.
we're all ready for you."
Jenny walked slowly towards the front of the class. She couldn't think properly. All around her, a sea of faces was watching. Jenny felt frightened as if she was drowning in her own terror. Suddenly, she saw a flash of something bright. Jenny saw the silvery flash of the watch. It still looked special. It still looked magical. Jenny lifted her head slowly and looked straight at Lee. He was sitting very straight. His chin was turned upwards slightly. As soon as Lee realized that Jenny was watching him, he gave her a quick thumbs-up sign. Jenny pulled back her shoulders. She lifted her head high. She took a deep breath, like someone who was about to dive into deep, deep water.
I am going to talk about swimming. Swimming is something that...
It was 10 minutes later when Miss Walker stopped her.
That was a fantastic speech, Jenny. How wonderful to have a talent like that. Now, who's going to go next?
At break time, Lee found Jenny in the playground. Your speech was great. It must be really hard work, getting up so early in the morning and everything, he said.
I'm just used to it. I don't think about it,
said Jenny. Still, you're lucky. I wish I could do something like that. I can't even swim. Jenny looked amazed.
But the watch? I thought you must be able to swim because your watch is the kind you can wear underwater.
Only in my dreams. My dad gets them cheap. He's got a market stall and sells all sorts of stuff. Trainers, sports gear, jewelry. Lee laughed. It's not really a very good watch. It doesn't keep time very well. He showed Jenny the watch. I set it after I got it back from you, but it's already 10 minutes slow. Jenny stared at him for a moment. She didn't know what to think or say. Here, Lee undid the strap. You can wear it if you like. Borrow it for the day. Jenny looked down at the watch. The bright sun was dancing all over the silver, making it look more sparkly than ever. Suddenly, she shook her head.
Thanks, but I'd better not. I might lose it or something.
She smiled, remembering how everyone had crowded round her in class earlier. They had asked her lots of questions about swimming.
I don't think I really need the watch anymore,
added Jenny. Lee put the watch back on. Let me know if you change your mind. He gave her a quick grin and ran off. Jenny watched him go. She didn't move, but inside her tummy, she felt something move. It was as if a wonderful dolphin had just gone leaping through her.
Greyfriars Bobby. Chapter 1. Bobby was a little grey and silver dog. He was a little scrap of a dog. He often looked a little bit ruffled and scruffy, like an old teddy bear. He had big brown eyes, soft silky ears, strong short legs, and a very, very waggy tail. Bobby was a happy little dog. He always looked as if he was smiling. He spent his time with a shepherd called Old Jock. Jock was getting a bit too old to work, but he was not a rich man, so he had to carry on working. Bobby helped him. Bobby didn't really belong to Old Jock. He really belonged to a farmer and his family, but Bobby did not like to sit at home in a warm farmhouse. He loved being out in the fresh air. He loved the wind in his ears. He loved the smell of outdoors in his nose. but best of all, he loved Jock. Jock was a tough old man, a man of few words. He had no family, no wife, no bairns, no house of his own. He had to work outside in all kinds of weather, even in the cold and rain. He had to sleep where he could. There was very little to make his life warm and comfortable. It was a hard life for an old man. So Jock was not a man for soft words and fine feelings. But he had Bobby, and Bobby was a good friend. Old Jock would talk to Bobby as if Bobby could understand. Jock would tell Bobby what a good dog he was. He would tell him what a clever dog he was. He would tell Bobby what a lively little dog he was. Jock did not actually use those words. He had his own special way of speaking.
"You're a canny wee dog, aren't you?"
Jock would say, and Bobby would bark,
"Yep,
as if he agreed.
and you're sperrity too." "Yep, yep."
Bobby agreed. Of course he was clever and lively. He would wag his tail so hard that his whole little body seemed to wag, and he would look up to Jock with his big brown eyes full of love and loyalty. Bobby loved to please old Jock, so he was quick to pick up tricks. He could roll over and over. He could sit up and beg. He could lie down and stay. He could even walk on his back legs.
"Yes, he's a canny dog,
Said old Jock.
and useful too."
Yes, Bobby was a useful dog. He could catch rats. He could chase away cats, and, on cold nights, he could snuggle close to his master to keep him warm. Chapter 2. There came a time when Jock was too old to carry on his work as a shepherd. He had to leave the hills and move to live in the city of Edinburgh. Bobby should really have stayed behind with the farmer as he belonged to him. But Bobby was not the sort of dog you could just own. He chose who was going to be his master, and he chose old Jock. So Bobby set off and followed old Jock all the long and dusty way to Edinburgh. This was about 100 years ago. The Queen at that time was Queen Victoria. There were no cars and buses to take Jock and Bobby to the city. In the city, there was no electricity. There were no radios, no televisions, no videos, but there was still plenty of noise. Bobby was frightened by all the noise. There were so many people shouting and calling and pushing. There were so many carts rolling by, and there were so many horses' feet clip-clopping just next to Bobby's ears. It was frightening for a small dog who had just come from the peace and quiet of the hills. Then, in the middle of the day, there came the biggest sound of all. Boom! The air shook, birds scattered, babies cried.
"Don't you worry,"
said old Jock.
"it's the cannon. They fire it every day at midday to let people know the time. It lets us know it's time for dinner."
Old Jock found a cheap eating place in the market square. He and Bobby settled down near the fire, and Jock had some good broth and bread. Mr. Trail, the owner, saw them.
"Out,"
said Mr. Trail.
"We don't want dogs in here."
But then Bobby sat up and begged. He put his paw out to shake hands, and soon he was rolling over and walking on his back legs and performing all his tricks for the customers. Mr. Trail let Bobby stay. From that day on, old Jock and Bobby would wait for the boom of the cannon. Then they would go for their meal in the market square. Mr. Trail grew fond of Bobby. He often saved a special bone for the clever little dog. Life in the town was not easy for Jock. The air was not fresh as it was in the countryside. Jock did not have a lot of money, so he had to stay in the very poorest part of the town. He had to rent a cheap room, and he was always afraid someone would try to steal his little bit of money and the few things he owned. Bobby was a great comfort to him. Night after night, he kept his master warm. Day after day, he guarded his master from thieves. With each passing day, Jock got slower and slower. He was very old now. He could not see well. He could not hear well. His legs were shaky. He was worn out and tired. One day, old Jock staggered back to his room, feeling very ill indeed. He had been out in the cold and the rain. All night long he coughed and coughed. During the night, when Jock was freezing cold, Bobby lay on his master's feet, trying to warm them. When Jock was boiling hot, Bobby licked his master, trying to cool him down. But Bobby couldn't make Jock better. All that night, Jock groaned and moaned. He tossed and turned, and coughed and coughed and coughed. Then he sighed and whispered,
I'm away to my home now. Goodbye, Bobby.
Suddenly, he was very still. Bobby understood. His master was dead, but Bobby stayed keeping watch over the body of his master. He was a faithful little dog. For 2 days and nights, Bobby stayed by his dead master. Finally, the police broke down the door and found the body of old Jock. His little bit of money and his few belongings were still safe. They had been guarded by Bobby.
Aye, that is a canny dog,
said the police.
He's kept old Jock's money safe. It can pay for a proper burial.
They sent for a coffin and some men to carry Jock to Greyfriars Kirkyard. Old Jock was going to be given a proper burial in a proper churchyard. He would have been pleased and proud that his life had ended in such a way. Chapter 3. The men carried the coffin through the streets. Jock had no family or friends, no wife or barns to follow the coffin, but there was Bobby. He trotted behind the coffin all the way to the kirkyard, but just as they were all going through the gates, a voice bellowed,
Can't you read?
It was Mr. Brown. He was in charge of the kirkyard. He pointed to the sign, No dogs allowed.
Oh,
said one of the men.
let the dog in, just for the burial. He's a faithful dog, looking out for his master. We'll soon be finished, and then he'll be off.
Mr. Brown felt a little sorry for the dog, but,
Rules are rules,
he said,
no dogs allowed.
and he picked Bobby up and put him outside the kirkyard gate. As soon as Mr. Brown was not looking, Bobby sneaked back in. He stood by the grave and watched as the earth was piled onto the coffin. Bobby stood quietly, not one yip or wag of the tail. Then he lay down on top of the grave, as if to say,
That's my master in there, and it's my job to keep him company.
The next morning, Mr. Brown was surprised to see the dog again. Bobby was lying at the foot of his master's grave, like a little furry blanket.
Well, you're a faithful dog,
said Mr. Brown,
but rules are rules.
and he chased Bobby out of the kirkyard and slammed the gate shut.
Now, unless you know how to open a gate, you will just have to stay out there,"
he said. Mr. Brown walked back to his warm little house, leaving Bobby scratching at the gate. Soon, people began to pass by. Bobby ran up to each one of them and scratched and whined at the gate. Most people did not even look at the little dog. But the lads and lassies who lived all around were kinder. They patted him and played with him. Then one child opened the kirkyard gate and let Bobby in. The next morning, Mr. Brown came to check that all was well in the kirkyard. There was Bobby lying on his master's grave.
"No dogs allowed,"
shouted Mr. Brown, and he ran at little Bobby. Quick as a flash, Bobby skipped out of the way. Mr. Brown tried to catch him, but Bobby yipped and frisked happily and slipped right out of his hands. For half an hour, Mr. Brown shouted and chased, and Bobby trotted and tumbled all over the kirkyard. The children heard the noise and came out to see what it was. They laughed when they saw Mr. Brown trying to catch Bobby. Mr. Brown gave up, and as soon as his back was turned, Bobby lay back down on his master's grave. Night after night, Bobby lay down on the grave. He put his nose on his paws, and he stayed there all through the night. In the end, Mr. Brown gave up chasing Bobby out of the kirkyard. In fact, Mr. Brown became fond of the little dog, and sometimes he even gave him a bone to chew on. The children gave him scraps too, but Bobby had a plan of his own to get food. When the midday cannon boomed, Bobby trotted off to old Jock's favourite eating place in the market square. There, Bobby had his dinner with Mr. Trail. Then he came trotting back to lie on his master's grave. Chapter 4. Bobby stayed in the kirkyard all through that year. He stayed through rain and wind and snow. When the springtime sun and flowers came, still he stayed. He stayed the next year too, and the next, and the next. Every day, Bobby would wake up on top of the grave in Greyfriars Kirkyard. Then he'd yawn and stretch, and off he'd go visiting and playing with the children. When the cannon boomed at midday, off he would go for his dinner at Mr. Trail's. Bobby made friends wherever he went. Rich people, poor people, old and young, they all stopped to smile and pat Bobby. Everybody grew to love him. The children loved him most of all. This went on for 8 years. Then, one day, a police officer saw the little dog lying like a furry doormat at the foot of his master's grave.
"Is that your dog?"
he asked Mr. Brown.
"Show me his license and his collar." "He's not really mine,"
said Mr. Brown.
"He just stays here. Ask Mr. Trail in the market square. The dog goes there every day for his dinner." "Is this your dog?"
the police officer asked Mr. Trail.
"I wish he was my dog,"
said Mr. Trail.
"He's a fine dog, but he just comes here to eat. Then he's off back to the kirkyard to lie on his master's grave. He's a fine, faithful dog." "He's a stray,"
said the officer.
"and it's my job to get rid of strays."
When the children heard about this, they were horrified.
"You can't get rid of Bobby,"
they said.
"Is he your dog then?"
asked the police officer.
He's nobody's dog,"
said the children.
But please let him stay. "If he hasn't got a collar and a license and an owner, it's my job to take him away,"
said the officer.
"He's just a stray."
Nobody could say they owned Bobby, but many people loved him. They saw how good and brave and faithful he was, and they were ready to stand up for him. The children started to collect every penny they could. They wanted to try to buy a license for Bobby. It would cost a lot of money for such poor children to collect, but they found that many people in the area were willing to give a penny or two. Bit by bit, the money piled up. Mr. Trail went to the police station and begged the police officer to let Bobby stay.
"It's not for me to decide,"
said the police officer.
"You'll have to ask a judge about that." "Then I want the highest judge in all of Scotland to hear about this,"
said Mr. Trail. He went to the court to see the Lord Provost, the most important judge in all of Scotland. But the Lord Provost said he could not help.
"I have to keep the law,"
he said.
"The dog has no license. He has no collar. He belongs to nobody. So by the law, he is a stray."
As the Lord Provost was speaking, there was a loud clatter. The big doors to the court burst open, and in came a crowd of poor street children, scattering pennies as they came.
"We've got some money for a license,"
they said. The judge knew that these children were very poor.
"Have you stolen this money?"
he asked them. The children told the judge how they had all collected the pennies. Passers-by had given them pennies. Old people had given them pennies from their savings. Children had given what they could.
"Well,"
said the judge,
"this is a special dog that can bring out so much goodness in people,"
he said.
"but there is nothing I can do. You can't just buy a license for any dog. You have to own it. This dog is a stray. It belongs to nobody."
No, said the children.
Bobby belongs to everybody. "Ah,"
said the Lord Provost.
"that is the answer. The dog belongs to everybody. He belongs to the whole city of Edinburgh."
The Lord Provost gave Bobby a collar with a medal. On the medal it said that the dog had the freedom of the whole city. Now he belonged to all the people in the city. Bobby lived on for many happy years. Every night he lay on his master's grave. Every day he listened for the cannon, then he trotted off for his dinner. And all the time Bobby smiled and wagged and made friends with everyone. Even Queen Victoria became his friend. Wherever Bobby went, he brought a smile with him. He was nobody's dog, but he was everybody's dog. He was his own dog. He became the only dog in the history of the world to be given the freedom of the city. He could go where he liked. He wasn't a stray anymore. For 14 long, faithful years, he lived in Greyfriars Kirkyard. He became famous all over Scotland and all over the world. When he died, he was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard near his master. A fine statue was built. It is still there, so if you are ever in Scotland, in the city of Edinburgh, you can call in and visit Greyfriars Bobby.
Jumble the Puppy. Chapter 1. As soon as Dan learned to talk, he began to beg his parents to get him a puppy. First, he would try his mum. "Please, Mum, can we get a puppy? I promise I'll look after it and take it for walks. It won't be any trouble," said Dan.
"Dogs take a lot of looking after,"
said Mum.
"And anyway, I don't want a puppy digging up the garden now that I've got it looking nice."
Then Dan would try his dad. "Please, Dad, can we get a puppy?" begged Dan. "I'll make sure it doesn't dig up the garden, and I'll buy all its food out of my own pocket money." "Dogs take a lot of looking after," said Dad. "And anyway, we haven't got space in the house for a lively puppy." Every birthday and every Christmas, Dan hoped to find a puppy waiting for him in the hall. There were always lots of super presents, but no puppy. Dan began to think he would never get one. Then when he was 7, his parents gave in and bought him Jumble, a furry black and white puppy. He had floppy ears and a very waggy tail. Dan adored him. Each day, before and after school, Dan and Jumble would have great fun playing together. At night, Jumble would creep upstairs and sleep under Dan's bed, even though he had his own bed in the kitchen. As long as Dan was there, Jumble was happy. But when Dan was at school, Jumble was very lonely. One day, he wanted Mum to play with him, but she was busy at her computer. So Jumble played a game in the curtains, pretending Dan was hiding in them. Mum was cross when she saw the big holes in the curtains, so she sent Jumble out into the garden. Jumble wanted Mum to run around the garden with him like Dan did, but she was still busy. So Jumble played a game with the washing on the line. Then he dug up the grass, pretending to look for a lost bone. Mum was very cross when she saw the big holes in the lawn. As soon as Dan came home from school, Jumble was happy, but Mum wasn't.
"That dog's driving me mad,"
she said to her husband after Dan had gone to bed.
"I can't cope."
"What's he done this time?" asked Dad.
"This,"
she said, pointing at the torn curtains. "Oh, no," said Dad.
"But that's not all,"
said Mum, and she went to get the washing basket. One by one, she held up the clothes that Jumble had pulled off the line that morning. "Oh, no, not my best shirt," groaned Dad. "And look at my favorite jumper. It isn't much good with only one sleeve."
"Look what he's done to my knickers,"
said Mum, holding up a pair of shredded knickers. Mum put the clothes back into the basket and flopped down onto the couch.
"It's no good,"
she said.
"I just can't cope with Jumble."
"Perhaps he could stay in a kennel in the garden while Dan is at school," suggested Dad.
"Don't even think about it,"
said Mum wearily.
"I haven't shown you the mess he's made of the lawn. It looks like a building site. Holes everywhere."
Dad went to look for Jumble in the kitchen, but he wasn't there. "Humph," said Dad, as he climbed the stairs and peeped into Dan's bedroom. Dan was sound asleep, and so was Jumble. He was under Dan's bed, snoring quietly. Dad looked at Jumble. He looked so gentle. It was hard to believe it was the same dog who had caused so much damage. Dad came downstairs and sat back in his chair. He picked up the newspaper. "I suppose we'll have to arrange for someone else to look after him until he's past the mad puppy stage," said Dad. He stared at his wife through the hole Jumble had made in the newspaper. But it won't be easy telling Dan. Chapter 2. The next day was Saturday, and Dan and Jumble were looking forward to their favorite outing of the week. Every Saturday after tea, Dad took them to Smuggler's Wood. It was a patch of woodland not far from their house. Dan and Jumble loved to search there for buried treasure. Dad decided it would be easier to tell Dan about their plans for Jumble when they got to Smuggler's Wood. Dan was standing by the front door and Jumble was charging up and down the hall. "Come on, Dad. Jumble and I are ready." "I'm just getting my boots," said Dad, and he bent down to get his boots from the cupboard under the stairs. Jumble couldn't wait any longer. Spinning with excitement, he jumped up at Dan. Dan watched in horror as Jumble's wagging tail swept a vase of flowers crashing to the floor. For a moment, Dan thought nobody had seen what happened, as Dad still had his head in the cupboard. Then he heard Mum shriek,
"That really does it. That dog will have to..."
But Dan didn't hear what Mum said because Jumble was so startled by Mum's cry that he backed quickly away. He bumped into Dad, who was coming out of the cupboard backwards. Dad toppled head first into the cupboard. "Ow!" Dad yelled. Then there was a scraping sound and another even louder "Ow!" as a broom in the cupboard fell crashing down on Dad's head. Dan decided it was time to get Jumble out of the way. "We'll wait for you by the gate," he called to Dad, as he and Jumble ran from the house. By the time they got to Smuggler's Wood, Dad had almost stopped complaining about Jumble. Dan noticed a rather large bump on Dad's head, but he thought it would be a good idea not to mention it. Dan let Jumble off the lead as soon as they got to the woods. Smuggler's Woods has lots of great places where pirates could have hidden their treasure. Dan was sure that if he and Jumble looked hard enough, they could find some pirate's gold. Since he and Jumble had started playing the treasure hunt game, Dan had found silver bottle tops and shiny sweet wrappers. Jumble was good at nosing around in the undergrowth and finding treasure. Dan kept all the treasure they found in a box under his bed. Once last year, he had found a coin he thought was old and going to be worth lots of money. But when they got home and Dad washed off the mud, they saw the coin was shiny and quite new. Dad said, "I don't think there were many pirates round a few years ago." When Dan woke up the next morning, he had found a bag of gold coins on his pillow with a card from his dad. Inside it said, "Here's the treasure I bought with the treasure you found yesterday." It may not have been real treasure, but it was the tastiest. After Dan had eaten all the chocolate coins, he put the gold wrappers in the box under his bed. In the middle of Smuggler's Wood, Dan and Jumble set off for their latest search. They went straight to the river that flowed through the woods. "Look how much water there is," Dan said to Jumble. "It must have been raining a lot to make the river that deep." Jumble barked twice, as if to say he agreed with every word Dan said. "Come on, Jumble, let's go and look by the giant oak," called Dan. Then Dan heard Dad calling him. "Dan, Dan, there's something I want to talk to you about." "Don't worry, Dad. We won't play near the river," Dan shouted back. "It's about Jumble," said Dad, as he walked up to Dan. "I won't let Jumble go near the river either," said Dan. "It's not about the river," said Dad. "It's about Jumble. Your mother and I have decided that we just can't keep him. He gets into too much mischief when you're at school." "What do you mean?" asked Dan, looking puzzled. "Well, he's not really a suitable dog for us. We're going to have to find him another home." "But why?" asked Dan, his eyes filling with tears. "He's such trouble in the house, Dan," said Dad. "Every day he breaks or spoils something. It's like having a monster in the house." "Jumble is not a monster," cried Dan. "He's my best friend, and if you send him away, I'll run away too." Dan ran off to join Jumble. Dad watched his son throwing his arms around the dog. Chapter 3. Dad sat down on a log by the river, feeling sad for Dan. Jumble would have to go. Dad felt he had no choice. Dan will get used to the idea eventually, thought Dad. And if Jumble can be trained, then maybe one day he can come back to live with us. Dad threw a stick into the swirling river and watched it being tossed and flipped by the fast-flowing water. Meanwhile, Dan sat down under the giant oak, hugging Jumble. "I won't ever let them take you away," he told the dog. Jumble whined sadly and licked the tears from Dan's unhappy face. "I'll say that you'll promise never to break anything again," said Dan, and Jumble barked in agreement. "I'll say that from now on you'll stay in my room all the time, and if you break anything of mine, I won't mind," said Dan. Jumble put his head on one side, as if he was listening very carefully. Dan was cheering up. As soon as Jumble saw a smile on Dan's face, he leapt around and started searching for treasure. "That's right, Jumble," said Dan. "I bet we'll find some real treasure today." Dad stood up from the log to see where Dan and Jumble had gone. He was pleased to see them both playing the treasure hunt game. Perhaps Dan understands why Jumble must go, thought Dad, and maybe we could get him a present of some sort to make up for not having the dog. He's always going on about some kind of bike. Yes, that's it. We'll get him a bike, and he'll soon forget about Jumble. Dan and Jumble ran around the wood looking for treasure. They looked under stones and in hollow logs. They found some tin foil, which Dan put in his pocket, but they didn't find a single coin. "No treasure this time, boy," said Dan, ruffling the fur between Jumble's ears. "We'd better get back to Dad. He'll be waiting for us." Jumble had one last search in a pile of leaves, and then he rushed over to join Dan. When they got back to the log where Dad had been waiting, there was no sign of him. "Dad! Dad!" called Dan. "Where are you?" There was no reply. Dan called again. "Dad! Dad!" shouting at the top of his voice. But there was still no answer. Dan listened as hard as he could, but all he could hear was the sound of the rushing river. Then Jumble started to bark. "Be quiet, Jumble. I'm trying to listen for Dad." But Jumble went on barking. He was running round and round in circles at the top of the river bank. Dan called to him, "Stop it, Jumble. Don't be naughty. I've got to listen for Dad." But Jumble would not stop. He barked all the louder. Dan went over to him. Then he saw what was making Jumble bark so madly. At the bottom of the riverbank, beside the flowing water, was Dad. "Dad, what are you doing down there?" asked Don. "I thought you always told us it was dangerous to go near the river." "Get some help, Dan," called Dad. "I've hurt my ankle, and I can't move." "Don't worry, Dad," he called. "I'll go and tell Mum. I'll be as quick as I can. Come on, Jumble. We've got to get help." Dan began to run in the direction of the house. Then he realized that Jumble was not with him. He turned round to see Jumble sitting at the top of the riverbank. "Come on, Jumble. This is important," yelled Dan. But Jumble would not move. "Bad dog," said Dan crossly. "Maybe Mum and Dad are right. Maybe you are too naughty." With that, Dan turned away and ran off to his house. Chapter 4. So Dan didn't see Jumble climbing down the slippery, steep riverbank. He didn't see Jumble walk carefully over to Dad and gently muzzle his hand. For a long time, Jumble lay quietly by Dad. The last bits of light disappeared from the sky, and it was pitch black. Suddenly, Jumble got to his feet and began to bark. "Quiet, Jumble. There's a good boy," whispered Dad. But Jumble continued to bark. Dad saw a light at the top of the bank, and Jumble barked even louder. Then Dad heard a voice. "Are you all right down there?" Before long, an ambulance man was making his way along the riverbank to where Dad lay. "You're a very lucky guy," said the man. "We didn't know how we were going to find you. We couldn't hear anything above the noise of the river, but when your dog barked, we knew we'd found you." Then the ambulance man looked at Dad's ankle. "Looks like a break," he said. "Don't worry. We'll have you out of here in no time." Jumble stayed close to Dad. "You've got a fine dog there," said the man. "He's really looking after you." "I know," said Dad. "He found me in the first place, and he's kept me warm ever since. It's been like having a hot water bottle." "He looks like he's only a puppy," said the man. "You certainly owe him a lot." "Actually, he's my son's dog, to tell you the truth, and he's a bit of a monster," said Dad. "Who is?" asked the ambulance man, rather surprised. "Your son?" "No, the dog," said Dad. "He's a bit of a wrecker. You should see what he can do to a line of washing." "Well, I'd be proud of him if he was my dog," said the man. "He's done you a big favor tonight." The ambulance man gave Jumble a pat on the back. Jumble licked the man's face and whimpered in delight. He wagged his tail so hard against the man's leg that it sounded like a drum being struck by a giant. "He's a friendly little thing, isn't he? He must be such fun to have around." Dad smiled faintly. "Here I come," called a voice from above. Slowly, another ambulance man brought a stretcher for Dad. The men strapped him in. "Okay, let's go," they said. Slowly, the men carried Dad up to the top of the bank. Jumble scrambled up the riverbank to be there to greet him. Mum was waiting at the top of the bank.
"Whatever happened?"
she asked. "Well," said Dad, "I feel a bit silly. I saw something gold and shiny sticking out of the riverbank, and I tried to pull it out. I leaned over a bit too far, and I slipped." "You found some buried treasure?" asked Dan excitedly. "Not exactly," said Dad, and he felt for something in his pocket. He stuck his hand out from under the blanket. In his hand was a golden crisp packet. "This is the buried treasure," he said sheepishly. Dan took the crisp packet. "I'll put it with all the other treasure in the box under my bed," he said. "Come on, mate. The ambulance is waiting to take you to hospital." The men carefully lifted the stretcher. "Never mind, Dan," said Dad. "There will be plenty of time for you and Jumble to search for real buried treasure. And maybe, after a few puppy training classes, he might even learn to behave himself in the house too." "Does that mean Jumble can stay?" asked Dan excitedly. "What do you think?" asked Dad, smiling up at his wife.
"How could we possibly let him go?"
Mum said.
"He's a hero." Star Striker. Chapter 1. Sasha stood on her own in the school playground. Lots of children were racing and chasing round her. None of them even glanced at Sasha. "I wonder if I've turned invisible," she thought sadly. But she knew that she hadn't really turned invisible. It was just that everybody at this school already had lots of friends. They were all too busy with each other to want anyone new. Sasha wished there was something really special about herself, something that would make the other children like her straight away. She wished she could make a new friend on her very first day. She walked to the edge of the playground. She wanted to sit on the wooden bench and think about her old school and her old friends. She began to dream about life before her family had to move to Grandad's house to look after Grandad. Suddenly, she bumped straight into someone who was walking past.
"Hey, watch it! You've made me drop all my stickers."
"I'm sorry," said Sasha. She looked up to see a dark-haired boy scowling at her. She bent down to help him pick up the stickers. Some of them had bits of mud and grit stuck to them.
"They're pictures of famous footballers,"
the boy told her.
"You get them free with Super Chew bubblegum. I'm going to be a famous footballer one day."
"I'm sorry," Sasha said again. "Can I clean them for you?"
"No,"
said the boy crossly as he pushed the stickers into an envelope.
"I'll sort them out when I get home. I've got a special album for them."
He looked at Sasha for the first time and frowned.
"You must be new. What's your name?"
he asked. "Sasha," she said.
"I'm Ben. Ben Griggs."
He smiled suddenly.
"I'm sorry I was so cross. It must be rotten to be new. What's your second name?"
Sasha looked at him for a moment. She hated saying her second name. People always made jokes about it. "It's Dazzle," she said. She waited for Ben to laugh. Instead, he frowned again. This time, it wasn't a cross frown. It was more of a puzzled frown.
"Dazzle. Dazzle. I've heard that name somewhere before,"
he said. "Not many people have. It's a bit odd," said Sasha. Ben began looking through the stickers in his envelope.
"Here it is,"
he said excitedly.
"Derry Dazzle. This is a picture of him, and it says on the back he was a real star player. The crowds used to go wild when he was on the pitch."
She stared at the black and white picture. It showed a man with wavy hair. He looked nice and friendly. He had bright, twinkly eyes and the sort of sparkling white teeth you see in toothpaste adverts.
"Is he a relative of yours?"
Ben asked. He was hopping round her, giving tiny kicks with the inside edge of his trainers to a screwed-up bubblegum wrapper. Sasha was about to say no. She was going to tell him that there was nothing famous about her family, unless you counted the sports day when Dad was the talk of the school. He'd got his nose broken in the parents' tug-of-war. All the time Mum was in the local paper, she'd found a cockroach in a packet of Toffee Delight pie mix. But Ben had stopped hopping about and was gazing at her as if she was a magician about to pull a rabbit from her hat. She couldn't let him down. It's my dad,
Your dad?
said Ben, giving the bubble gum wrapper a swift kick. It went skimming into a bin, scoring a perfect goal.
Wow, that's amazing. Your dad was a famous footballer, and you've come to our school. You'll have to tell me everything about him.
Chapter 2. At playtime, Ben came up to Sasha.
What position did your dad play?
He asked. Sasha thought wildly. She didn't know much about football, but she'd watched the World Cup on telly once. Striker, she said.
Wow, striker. Only the best players get to be strikers. How many goals did your dad score?
Ben asked. Sasha shrugged. Oh, I don't know. He doesn't talk much about it. Ben looked at Sasha as if her hair had turned green.
Doesn't he?
Said Ben.
If I was a famous footballer, I'd want the whole world to know.
He's a bit shy, said Sasha. Ben got out the picture again. The grinning footballer with the sparkling toothpaste teeth.
He doesn't look shy in this picture.
Sasha looked at the picture. That was before the accident. Ben's jaw dropped.
What happened?
He was in the middle of a game. Someone from the other team made a flying tackle. He broke his nose. Sasha looked straight at Ben for the first time. At least that bit was true. Ben looked puzzled again.
A broken nose isn't much. Loads of footballers get that.
Sasha made her voice sound sad. But it was terrible for Dad. He'd been so handsome before. She shrugged. You see, he was very proud of how he looked. He just couldn't handle not being perfect. He retired from the game and married my mum. If it hadn't been for her, I don't know what would have happened to him. Sasha gave Ben a small smile. That bit was true too. Or so Mum was always saying. Ben was still staring at the photograph.
Well, he looks like a really nice bloke in this picture.
He is a nice bloke. Suddenly, Sasha felt rotten. She didn't like saying horrible things about Dad. She wished more than ever that she had never started this. Ben pulled another empty bubblegum wrapper from his pocket, rolled it into a ball, and began passing it from one foot to the other.
Do you think he'd come into school one day and coach our team?
He said.
Mr. Clark, who takes us for football, would think it was great.
Sasha said, panicking again. The thing is, all that's behind him now. It's all in the past. It might kind of, make him remember things he wants to forget. It might make him unhappy again.
Oh, right.
Ben looked pretty unhappy himself. Sasha felt really mean. Ben had been so excited to hear about her dad, and now she was having to spoil it all for him. But she had to do it. She couldn't take the risk of him finding out the truth. She took a deep breath. So, I have to ask you not to tell anyone else about him. It just wouldn't be fair on Dad, you see?
Yes, sure.
Ben nodded.
Don't worry. Your secret is safe with me. It was nice of you to tell me about him anyway.
He tried to smile, but Sasha noticed that he had stopped kicking the bubblegum wrapper round. Instead, he crushed it with his heel and then threw it in the bin. She felt about as nice as a wasp inside a lollipop. Chapter 3. When Sasha got home from school, Mum was in the kitchen making toffee pie. "Have you had a nice day?" she asked Sasha. "Not really," said Sasha. "Come on." Mum squeezed her shoulder. "It can't have been that bad. Did you make any new friends?" Sasha thought for a minute. She'd made a mess of everything. She wanted to tell Mum about Ben. She wanted Ben to be her friend. But instead, she'd ruined everything with her stupid lies. Grandad was asleep in the corner of the room. He had his mouth open, and he didn't have his false teeth in. "Why doesn't Grandad wear his false teeth?" Sasha hissed at Mum. It really made her cross. "Shh," Mum whispered back. "I expect they're uncomfortable for him." "But it's horrid," said Sasha. "It makes him look like he's not dressed properly." "Some old people stop caring about how they look," said Mum. "Nothing seems important to them anymore. They just get bored and lonely, and they seem to lose interest in things. That was why Dad wanted us to come and live here with Grandad." Sasha stared at Grandad for a moment. Mum was probably right. Grandad never seemed interested in anything much. He slept for most of the time, and when he was awake, he seemed distant and sad. The cross feeling left her, and she felt sad too. She didn't know Grandad very well. They hadn't been to see him much over the years, because he'd always lived too far away. Just then, there was a knock at the door. "Can you get that?" said Mum. "I'm up to my elbows in toffee pie." "Well, it won't be for me," grumbled Sasha, but she got up anyway.
"Hi, Sasha,"
said Ben, standing on the doorstep with a football under his arm.
"I was just passing. I hope you don't mind.
He lowered his voice to a whisper.
I just couldn't resist seeing where Derry Dazzle lives. I won't stay, I just..."
"Oh, how lovely!" Mum appeared, wiping her hands on a piece of kitchen towel. "I knew you must have made friends with someone today. Why don't you ask your friend in? The toffee pie will be ready soon." Ben's face lit up.
"Thanks, Mrs. Dazzle. I'm Ben. I love toffee pie."
And before you could say sticky fingers, he was in. Sasha followed him into the kitchen. Ben put the ball down and it rolled slowly along the kitchen floor, coming to rest by Grandad's feet. Grandad opened one eye, looked down at the ball, and then shut his eye again. Nobody noticed. Mum began fussing round the oven. Sasha noticed that Ben was gazing round the room. He was probably looking for football trophies or bobble hats or long stripy scarves. She looked round the room herself. At least there weren't any pictures of Dad about. They hadn't been there long enough to have unpacked everything yet. Sasha leaned across the table and whispered to Ben, "Don't say anything about you-know-what, will you?"
"I promise,"
Ben whispered back. Mum put the toffee pie on the table. "Now, who'd like a piece of this pie?"
"Yummy,"
said Ben. "I suppose so," grunted Sasha. "Perhaps Grandad would like some too," whispered Mum, "but I think he's still asleep." "He probably couldn't manage to eat it without his teeth anyway," Sasha said grumpily. Sasha began to eat the toffee pie. She knew she would have to get Ben out of the house soon, before Dad got back. Then she had an idea. She gave Ben her brightest smile and said, "Maybe you could teach me a bit about football after we've had this. We could go down to the park and practice penalty shootouts or whatever it is footballers do."
"Okay,"
said Ben, between mouthfuls of toffee pie. Over in the corner, Grandad opened the other eye and then shut it again. Nobody noticed. Sasha finished eating and stood up to brush the crumbs from her lap. Suddenly, the door opened and a loud, cheerful voice said,
"Toffee pie, my favourite."
"Dad," Sasha said faintly.
"Mr. Dazzle,"
said Ben, and he leapt to his feet as if the king himself had just walked into the room. Chapter 4. Ben whispered,
"His nose looks fine."
as Sasha's dad went to hang up his jacket. He had an operation. He didn't like people staring at him all the time, Sasha whispered back.
"They did a good job then."
Ben said, sounding impressed. It cost him loads of money though. He spent everything he'd earned playing football on it. That's why we haven't got much money now. Sasha's voice was quiet. She hoped Ben would feel embarrassed and not ask any more questions. It seemed to work. Ben got up and went over to get his football. It was still resting against Grandad's foot. Dad walked back in.
"So you like football?"
he said.
"Yeah, it's great,"
said Ben.
"I'm going to give Sasha a lesson."
Ben looked at Sasha, who gave him a look sharp enough to puncture any ball.
"Teaching Sasha will be about as easy as teaching a giraffe."
Dad laughed.
"She's like me, all legs and elbows. I prefer playing golf." "Really?"
Ben frowned and he glanced at Sasha again. Sasha had discovered a loose thread on the bottom of her school jumper. She began winding it tightly round her finger.
"Much to Sasha's granddad's disappointment, of course."
Dad added.
"Did he play then?"
Ben tucked the football under one arm and shuffled from foot to foot. He pulled a packet of bubble gum out of his pocket and began turning it over and over in his hand. He looked more and more uncomfortable. Sasha was squirming too. She could tell Ben was being polite. He probably didn't know what to say. He probably thought that Sasha's dad was trying to throw him off the scent. Dad laughed.
"He was a star in his day."
He went over to the drawer in the big wooden cabinet and pulled out a photograph. He showed it to Ben and Sasha. Ben gasped and dropped the bubblegum packet on the floor. Sasha pulled the piece of loose thread so tight that it snapped. They both knew that face. They both knew those teeth. Derry Dazzle. Sasha's granddad was Derry Dazzle. They both turned and stared at Grandad. Grandad had opened both eyes now and was watching them quietly. Sasha's dad walked over and stood behind him, putting his hand on Grandad's shoulder.
"You could teach this lad a thing or two about football, couldn't you?"
Grandad smiled. It was a big, toothless smile. It wouldn't have made anyone rush out to buy his brand of toothpaste. But as he held out his thin, shaking hands to take the football from Ben, Sasha was watching him. She hadn't seen him look like this before. He didn't look sad anymore. His face looked nice and friendly. His eyes looked bright and twinkly. Sasha looked at Ben. Then she shrugged and grinned. She had some explaining to do, but judging from the way Ben grinned back, he would understand. "Toffee pie, Grandad." Mum came over to join them.
"Not for me."
Grandad chuckled. He turned the ball over and over in his hands. He let it drop on the floor and bounce up again. He gave it a swift kick with the inside edge of his slipper. It went skimming underneath the sideboard, scoring a perfect goal.
"But if you could pop upstairs and get my teeth for me, I wouldn't mind a bit of this lad's bubblegum."